Hi, Nick. I appreciate you coming on. This is a real honor.
No, I appreciate the invite, and it's nice to do something that's not necessarily just core wildlife, core deer subjects. So I appreciate the variety of your show.
Absolutely. That was going to be my first comment. Is I'm sure you go on a lot of hunting shows. This is definitely not a hunting podcast. That being said, I do hunt. I've grown up hunting, and it's something I'm very interested in. So I saw your stuff on Instagram or maybe YouTube at first. Followed you for a bit and said I want to have a conversation with this guy. So I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, most people run the other way once they followed me for a while, so I appreciate that.
No, I find it interesting. It's I mean, we'll get into it, but deer are fascinating to me. Let's start here. I'm much more oriented towards stories. I one of my main curiosities in life is how people got to where they are from where they were, just how people become who they are. So that's my first question really is how did you get to where you are from where you were being however far back you want to go.
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, I think the outdoors part of it I got honestly because I grew up in the countryside. Um, there just wasn't a lot to do out there. I mean, I lived 10 minutes from the nearest town, which wasn't a big town. Everybody in the neighborhood was into some type of hunting, fishing, outdoors. And so that part I got honestly. And then I certainly, for whatever reason, just took it to another level. So I wasn't just, I didn't want to just be casual about it. I'm like that about a lot of things, but I really sort of supercharged my interest in deer hunting in particular, archery hunting. Part of it is the competitiveness, trying to match wits and get close to an animal, which archery is not about how far you can shoot, it's how close you can get. And so that always got me excited. But when I've asked this question and I tell the story, I have to go back to high school. And when I was coming through high school, far less than half, maybe even a quarter of the people even were thinking about going on to college. And I was one of them. And so they used to have this program in the guidance office where you would answer a bunch of questions about what you're interested in, and it would spit out what might be the ideal career for you. And mine kept coming up with farmer. And I think it's because I lived in the school district was a farming school district, so I think it was set up to do that. But I just knew I wanted to do something conservation-wise in the outdoors, and so my bachelor's degree was in environmental conservation. My master's degree is actually psychology, which is a little bit different, but you use that in every aspect of your work, so I'm really glad that I did that. But no, I did conservation my entire career, starting off primarily in sort of stream and river conservation work. Did that for quite a while, and then eventually just did waterfowl for a while and did some hunting right sportsman's issues. But I had the opportunity to get in and start working with deer, which was my number one point of interest and passion. And so when that opportunity came, I said, you know what, you're probably not going to get this chance again, so you better take advantage of it. So that's sort of the Cliff Notes version of how I ended up here. But yeah, I feel very lucky to be able to have a career in something that I'm passionate about.
Absolutely. I would consider that a massive blessing. You mentioned a word, conservation. I think a lot of words get not overused, but they kind of get the actual meaning of the word gets diluted over time and over use. What is conservation? What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So it can mean a lot of different things, but I'll use it in the context of what my organization's about. So the National Deer Association is a conservation organization, meaning we care about wild deer, we care about their health, we care about herd health, but we also care equally about things like habitat and the health of other wildlife. And so it's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this show, because you cover so many diverse topics and have a diverse audience. We need to be talking to people who, whenever they think of a deer, they're probably thinking about something they try to avoid with their vehicle or something they want to chase out of their flower garden, right? And so deer are actually critically important to all wildlife conservation because, let's say you have a listener listening to this, they'd never even dream or ever think of going hunting. Well, hunting is critical to wildlife conservation, particularly deer hunting, because 8 out of 10 people who buy a hunting license will hunt deer. They're doing so to hunt deer. The next closest species, matter of fact, if you add turkey and you add elk and upland game and waterfowl species, you're still not even getting to half of the number of people that hunt deer. And so when you look at how our state wildlife agencies generate money to do wildlife and habitat conservation, a big portion of that is coming from the sale of hunting licenses. And then there's another big chunk of money that they get from something called the Pittman Robertson Act. And that is a tax that is put on firearms and some archery related equipment, 11% tax that goes back toward wildlife conservation and goes to state agencies. And so when you think about how much deer are generating through the sale of hunting licenses, through Pittman Robertson dollars, and man, if you're somebody that just likes watching songbirds out your window, you should care about deer and deer hunting, because they are helping to greatly fund your wildlife agency that looks after all critters. And so deer are much more than a nuisance. They are very much a conservation species, and that's a message that we've been trying to get out even more.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially for myself. Like I mentioned, having hunted deer for so long, and seeing the I've seen that statistic, 8 out of 10 in real life. Like pretty much everybody that I know that hunts at least hunts deer. Like they might hunt other species as well, but the common denominator is deer. And the Pittman Robertson Act is something I've spoken about on the podcast before, because I think it's, for a non-hunter, it can seem so counterintuitive to think that like hunting is an act of conservation. It almost like doesn't compute. But when you get into the nitty gritty and you understand that the money that funds conservation across the board largely comes from hunters, it begins to make a lot of sense. There's actually I'll ask this actually. So what about somebody that's in New York City that doesn't hunt? Why should they care about the health of deer, the deer population?
That's a great question. And so I think it's in just about everybody to have a fondness for wildlife. And I think if you poll people and you ask the basic question, do you care about wildlife and do you care about healthy, sustainable wildlife populations? They're going to say yes. I mean, nothing polls 100%. There are always some people that they maybe could just care absolutely less about that. But people care about it. And so they don't even have to necessarily care directly about deer. But if there's someone that loves wildlife, but then they would also say, but I'm against hunting. A lot of that comes just from a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding of why the hunting part of it is so important. We'll stick to deer again because that's the keystone species that my organization represents. If you were to have 1 year without hunting deer, number one, the population explosion, because deer are very prolific, is going to happen. You're going to feel that immediately. Okay, so now you do have more deer-human conflicts, and there are many of them, in the way of road kills, in the way of crop damage, in the way of property damage. Then you have the disease issue. I think a lot of people are aware of things like Lyme disease as an example. Well, the more deer carrying Lyme-carrying ticks ups the ante on the potential for Lyme disease as an example. I think that's one that people can relate to. One that people may not be as aware of, but is certainly out there, is chronic wasting disease, which is spreads very much the same way like COVID-19 spreads. If you have too many deer in one area, they can pass it along to each other, and that's a 100% fatal disease that kills any deer that contracts it. It's a brain disease. It's degenerative, and they will die within 2 years of contracting it. That's bad for deer. That's bad for hunting. And again, that's bad for conservation, because less deer, less hunting is less money. And so, you don't have to be a deer expert. What we want people to do, though, is at least consider that that's a pretty important animal to the landscape of everything that if we care about wildlife, that we should care about deer. And also, if I'm someone that just, I don't like the idea of hunting, be open-minded to that. Research it. Look at organizations like ours and see why it's so important. I had a conversation. We have a program, very popular program called Field to Fork. And so what our Field to Fork program does is it takes adult hunters, not youth, people that have never hunted before but have always wanted to try, and we take them through an actual program where we educate them, teach them everything about the firearm safety, whatever weapon we're hunting with, and we take them hunting, teach them how to cook it, teach them how to take care of the animal. And part of the reason we do that is to obviously get more people aware and get more people out in the outdoors and doing it. But it's just this process of, or one of the things that we tell them as part of that process is, and I just had this conversation at an event a week ago in Missouri. One of the things people can be uncomfortable with is the taking of a life. And I totally understand that. I'm still someone that, I'll practice catch and release insect control in the house, right? Drives my wife crazy. She'd like to kill them all. But I tell people, listen, we can all agree. We'll use a deer for an example. We can all agree that that deer is going to die. 100%. Okay? All living things do. And so let's take it a step further and talk about how that animal is going to lose its life. The options are injury, predation, disease. Even if a deer were to reach an old age and die of, quote, old age isn't something you die from. There are some pretty nasty symptoms to old age that as human beings, we gloss over them at times because we can be medicated and we can be treated and we can be made to feel pretty good as old age is setting in. Well, that doesn't happen for wildlife. And so the options for death in the wild, in most cases, are brutal. Whereas they can be taken by a hunter, which is most often lethal and quick and final, and that animal then gets used and it's able to be eaten or given to people who in need that could use it. And so again, if we can all agree that these animals are going to perish, and you look at the ways in which that's going to happen, hunting is in my view the most humane way that's going to happen. And it contributes back to conservation.
Yeah, I recently saw a video of I think it was a herd of elk. Somewhere out west, but these elk were just dead. Like they didn't get eaten, they didn't get shot, what happened was they got trapped in a massive snowfall and they literally died they froze to death. And I think that's a great point that you brought up. The way of death in nature is pretty brutal. There's not really a graceful way for an animal to die in nature other than a quick death from a well-placed arrow or a well-placed bullet. Like a predator is not going to be quick and ethical or humane in killing a baby deer or a baby elk or any of those things. So I think you're exactly right with that. And it's something that I think it's one of the hardest things to grapple with for non-hunter in my experience, in conversations with my friends that have never hunted or that are against hunting, is the idea that you're killing an animal. But you're exactly right. Like that animal will die one way or another. It can die in a vicious way and not be used, like in the example of chronic waste disease or freezing to death. Or I as a hunter or you as a hunter can go out, partake in the actual cycle, be an ethical hunter, or at least as ethical as you can be, and make sure that you're training and putting on the best, or putting, I guess what would be the word, making the best shot that you possibly can and killing that animal as quickly as you can. That's generally going to be the most graceful and what's the word, holistic way for that animal to perish. And so it's something I think perhaps you can relate to this as well, growing up in a hunting environment. I think I've taken that for granted, having grown up with hunting. I know adult people who have never shot a gun, never held a gun, let alone actually aimed it at an animal and pulled the trigger. So I think that field to fork thing y'all are doing, it sounds incredible. Is that a pretty well received program?
Yeah, it's very well received. Matter of fact, when we first started it years ago, the Wall Street Journal picked it up and did a really nice article on it because it was so, I guess, different than what you typically see out there. We literally just started going to farmers markets and set up a booth and ask people, hey, would you like to try some venison? And most people would say, well, heck yeah, I'd like to try some venison. And you give them something, and then you start the conversation. And so I totally get where somebody has not grown up anywhere around hunting at all, or even around wildlife for that matter, that they might have concerns or a lot of questions about hunting and may not be uncomfortable with it. I get that. But I think with some thought put behind it, like we've talked about here today, that Field to Fork program certainly does that. It changes perspectives. I mean, this event that I was just at in Missouri, we had 15 brand new hunters. My mentee was from St. Louis area. He had never shot at a deer, and he's in mid-30s. And we're sitting there in the blind. We've gone through all the education. We've gone through the target practice. And I'm just sort of talking him through the whole thing, and he's asking me all kinds of questions. Ones that is someone that's been hunting, well over 30 years, I don't think about anymore. But as a brand new hunter, he's asking me, well, what do the deer do during the day? Where do they go? And so people have all of these questions. That program is one little way of us sort of answering those questions and getting more people out there that have never done it. And one of the things that's cool about it is we have many people that were mentees, went out hunting for the first time, and then shortly thereafter they come back and they're mentors now, and they're teaching new people.
Very cool.
And we're also finding out that over 80% of the people that participate in one of our events continue to hunt. That's pretty awesome. 8 out of 10 people are going to continue to hunt after they go through that program. So that's something we're pretty proud of.
I think that's remarkable. That's because you're exactly right. There's things that you take for granted having hunted for 30 years in your case, like that somebody that doesn't know how to hunt or hasn't hunted just simply doesn't know. Even as simple as what time to hunt, where do you hunt? Like like you said, what are the deer doing? Where do I place the shot? How do I get the right equipment? And then you go down the rabbit hole, and obviously people devote their whole lives like yourself to the pursuit of wild animals, and there's just an infinite amount of things that you can learn. Probably, I would guess everybody that hunts will die a novice in some regard in hunting. There's just infinite variables, and I think the retention rate speaks to the quality of the program. I'm not super familiar with it, but I find that fascinating that 8 out of 10 people continue to hunt, that's special. That raises a question though. Do we need more or less hunters?
Yeah. So it's kind of a loaded question, right? Because if you look at, we have about the same number of hunters that we've had through history. What's changed, though, is the population's gotten bigger. So when we say we're losing hunters, we're losing the percentage of the population that hunts. We certainly do need more, because we need to continue the tradition, first of all, and I think it's unfortunate for people that just sort of get passed over. I can't tell you how many women we've had in the program that say, I've always wanted to hunt, but my dad always took my brothers and never asked me. Those types of things are going on out there, and they just get passed over. Or other people that never grew up in a hunting family, but they saw their neighbors doing it and were interested. And, hunting... Population control is the first reason. Food for our families is also part of the first reason. But hunting is not about killing as much as it's about living. And so it's about management of the whole species. It's about understanding where our food comes from. We've been separated in society from where our food comes from. And so we need more hunters in terms of making sure that we're able to take care of populations and maintain healthy herds. So that's the reason we need more hunters. But we certainly need more people aware of hunting and supportive of hunting, so that we can continue to do that too. Because it only takes a few really bad ballot initiatives or a really loud group of people that put a stop to it, and they think they're helping when in fact the opposite is true. They're actually doing far worse for the animals that they claim to care about. And they don't want to be bothered with the facts of the situation. It's very emotional. I get it. I used to work in the business to fight those people, and they are very, very passionate about what they believe, and it's hard to change that. So we just try to educate people, give them the opportunity if they want to try it, but also make them aware again of, we talk about that word conservation. Hunting is conservation, hunting is living, and I think a lot of people understand that.
Have you seen the video of Steven Ranella at like a book launch several years ago conversing with a vegan that came to his book launch?
I haven't seen that specific discussion, although I've seen similar. I've been part of some of those myself, but
It was an interesting. I recommend everybody. I'll probably link it in the show notes. I think it's a phenomenal example of how the conversation should happen, because the vegan goes to the book launch of a obviously a hunter. He wouldn't have gone otherwise.
right.
And he raises the question, like, how can you claim that you love this animal or that you care for this animal and then murder it? Was something along the lines of what he asked. And Steven Ranella so eloquently responded, saying, like, in a weird way, I would argue that I love the animal more than you do, in a way that you can never, unless you actually partake in a hunt. But I do think it was very cool because it wasn't an emotional conversation. They both presented their arguments. They were both open-minded. And to me, I just recommend everybody goes and watch that. It's like Steven Ranella versus vegan, I think, is what you can look up. But I'm sure you've had, being in the business for as long as you have, I'm sure you've had some pretty interesting interactions in that way as well.
Yeah, I used to do a fair amount of work in California several years ago, which can be a hotbed for anti-hunting folks, you know. And so one of the people I had interaction with, she flat out said, "Well, I think I'm against hunting," and we ended up having dinner. I purposely wanted to meet her and have dinner and discuss this with her. I'm not afraid of that discussion at all, and especially with somebody that wants to be reasonable. We have some people, they have no intention of being reasonable. They come on our Facebook page and they troll it, and a lot of these people aren't even from the United States. So those people, we're going to set them aside. You're not going to have discussion with unreasonable people. But this was a young woman. I think she was still a college student, and was doing a paper or presentation on this issue, and I agreed to meet with her. And it was good. She certainly came in with an opinion, and I think she left with a little bit of a different one. I'm not going to say that she was going to run out and become a hunter, but she certainly was challenged to think more broadly about what it means. And that's all we can ask for: reasonable conversation. As Steve said whenever he was having this discussion, that I love that animal probably more than you do. There's a lot of truth to that. I even see it here in my own community, and where I live, hunting is a huge deal in this part of the world in western Pennsylvania. But I live in this town where it's a small college town, and there's about 200 acres of green space that sits up on the hill that a lot of people like to hike. And what's happened there over time, though, is the forest has matured, but there's no understory. There's no early successional habitat. There are a lot of deer there. There are way too many deer there, and there's nothing for them to eat. But if you bring up this idea that we want to have a deer hunt to try to control that population, people lose their mind. And they act like they love the deer, and how could you possibly shoot the deer? And in the meantime, the deer are right there before their very eyes, struggling, and are going to continue to struggle because they're not managed. And the forest is going to struggle because it's not managed, and because they're unwilling to hear a reasonable, rational conversation about what needs to happen there. They want to talk about things like, well, we can do contraception or these other things that don't work. They've been proven everywhere not to work. They just cost tons of money. And if you want to talk about inhumane, I can't think of a more inhumane treatment to a deer than and they've done this in Staten Island a bunch, to tranquilize a deer and do a vasectomy on it and then put it back out there. You've done nothing for that deer except make the deer suffer, and that deer is still in the population. It still has the potential to get hit by a vehicle. It's still going to be eating the habitat down to nothing. What did you really accomplish? And so that's where it gets challenging, and that's where I get nervous because, again, I live in a town that, for the most part, people either hunt or at least support hunting here, but there's enough of a voice to get into the unreasonable. And they just can't accept the idea that, yes, unfortunately, the best way to manage this population and to have a healthy forest is to cut some trees and also to take some of these deer off the landscape so that they can be utilized, and it helps everything. And so that's a long, challenging conversation, but that's the reality.
Yeah, I've actually never heard of that. That's hard for me to even believe that somebody could conceptualize that as a more humane thing to do to an animal than remove one of its arguably its most its strongest imperative. Like a deer, you know what I mean? A deer's literal goal is to reproduce. So to argue that it's more humane to disallow that deer to be able to exercise one of its natural instincts is that's pretty incredible. But I think it just shows that that's a pretty dogmatic way to look at it. And I think that you're exactly right in that the conversation you have with that young lady, and I'm sure many others that you've had, where people are genuinely, it starts with care for wildlife, as we've mentioned. Like the vast majority of people, we have that common denominator. We care about wildlife. I guess the way that we go about exercising that care is different, but a even semi deep level of research, or even surface level, if you do any type of research on populations, wildlife biology, all these things, you'll understand that it's absolutely necessary, because as you mentioned, that deer that can no longer reproduce will now be taking away from resources from all the other deer, and then it's still in the population. But I suppose it's actually one of the blessings and one of the biggest curses of deer, particularly whitetails specifically, is their resilience. They can I don't know the exact population number, but they can live in some pretty extreme places and make do out of some pretty extreme circumstances, which is, I guess, a good and a bad thing, but it's the way it is. My question to you based on that is, what's the biggest what would you say? What's the biggest thing that's potentially harmful, or the biggest enemy that deer face right now in America? What's like the biggest thing that could harm the overall wild deer population?
Well, chronic wasting disease is a gigantic threat to deer. And it's not just white-tailed deer, it's elk, it's moose, caribou, are susceptible to chronic wasting disease. And like I said earlier, it is a 100% fatal disease. So if a deer gets it, it's going to die. And like I said, it spreads very much like COVID-19 spread. Too many animals, they can interact with each other, they can exchange bodily fluids, just being around each other, and they don't even have to touch each other. They can pick it up from the ground, they can pick it from licking branches. Deer are very social species. They're always sort of leaving their scent marker. If you ever watch your cat walk around the house and they're rubbing on stuff, that's what they're doing. They're just walking around, leaving their scent markers. Well, deer do that all day long. I mean, that's what they're doing. And unfortunately, they can spread the disease that way. And so less hunters thinning the herd, just like if you have too many, you go to a big party. What did they tell us whenever COVID was running rampant? Don't go to big holiday gatherings, okay? Because when you go in there, you're walking into a situation where the disease loves that, because it's going to spread more easily. It's the same thing with deer. If you've got we'll use this property where I live as an example. If chronic wasting disease gets into this population, and there are so many deer there, and they're all sort of confined, hanging out in that same area, you're just asking for that disease to spread. And so this has been going on for a long enough time now. We're seeing it spread. I think we're up to 33 different states now that chronic wasting disease has been found in. We are still trying to get caught up on the science, exactly what is causing it to spread. Why does it spread more in some places than others? What is the best way to manage it? Until the science catches up, we're trying to just keep deer herds lower if we can, sort of social distancing of deer. And otherwise, what you're going to see is, over a long period of time, you're going to see population decline. And, if you can imagine just sort of watching the deer disappear before your very eyes, that sounds extreme. And we're talking about something that would happen over, decades, not just a few years. That's very scary, because we don't have the answers. We have no cure. And so that's probably the biggest threat to wild deer. I mean, there are other things that are important. Habitat loss is one. People not harvesting enough deer. We have an initiative right now where we're encouraging people to fill their tags. They're not shooting enough antlerless deer. So that's a problem. But yeah, the biggie out there right now is chronic wasting disease.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to touch on that a good bit. obviously that's, I mean, I've seen videos where it looks like they kind of just like lose their mind at a certain point. Is that more or less what happens? They kind of just, it just degenerate to the point where they can't function.
Yes, so it is a wasting disease, which basically that means what you just said. So they will just sort of continue to waste. But so a deer can carry this for as long as 2 years. You you may not even notice it, and you likely won't notice it even in the first year that a deer has this, because they walk around and they just look like a normal deer. But the problem is that it's a prion disease, and as the prions are interacting, in the brain, particularly in the central nervous system, they are slowly but surely working away at that deer until the point where it starts showing the clinical symptoms. And the clinical symptoms are they lose fear of humans, they can just stand there and drool, they can just do a lot of things that you don't expect a wild deer to do, look lethargic, and to the point where they basically lose their minds completely and they die. I mean, it's again, going back to how animals die, it's a very ugly and slow death. A lot of times it happens where people can't see it. Also, deer is back in the woods, this happens, nobody even notices it. And so we have people that are naysayers about chronic wasting disease, and they say, well, I don't see a bunch of dead deer laying everywhere. Well, that's not how it works. It's an animal by animal situation that it takes time, and it doesn't happen right in front of you. So there's other research as well that shows that if a deer has chronic wasting disease, it's also likely to die of some other factor before CWD ultimately gets it, because it's not thinking the same way as a normal healthy deer would. It's going to be more susceptible to predation, more likely to be hit by a vehicle. You'd be surprised at how many CWD cases are found because they're sampling deer that are roadkill deer, and they're finding out that they have CWD. So they're dying of those reasons, more susceptible to hunting. So they're dying before CWD even gets them, because again, these animals aren't thinking correctly. It is a brain disease, and so it makes them more susceptible.
Does it spoil the meat? Like, so say I killed a deer that has no noticeable signs, maybe a couple months into contracting it. Like, is that meat unsafe to eat?
So the Center for Disease Control recommends that you don't eat a deer if you know that it has chronic wasting disease. There has never been any documentation of a human being getting CWD, so there is a species barrier there. We make assumptions that thousands of CWD positive deer are eaten every year because people just don't know. They don't get their deer tested. And so we've never seen a case where somebody got CWD, or if they did, that it had any impact on humans. That's continually studied. We're still looking into that. That would be scary if we ever did find that connection. But we encourage people to get their deer tested. So most state wildlife agencies will offer free testing. But even just for your own peace of mind, there's all kinds of information on our website, the National Deer Association, that shows people how to submit samples, what happens as part of that sampling process. And so I can tell you, in Pennsylvania, where I live, on my land, I shot 2 deer this year, and I submitted samples for those deer, and both of those deer came back negative. So it was good peace of mind for me. Or I'm sorry, it come back not detected. There are nuances in how it's reported, but CWD was not detected in the deer that I shot. And so that gave information to the state wildlife agency who's managing the disease. It gave me information as a hunter that it's something that I don't need to be concerned about as I consume the animals. So,
is it a more regional? Like you said, 33 states. Are those all mostly northern states? Is it well dispersed? What's the like geographic limitations to the disease?
It's well dispersed across the country. If you go, the USGS has sort of the authority in terms of the map that you look at where chronic wasting disease is. So if you were to just Google USGS chronic wasting disease or chronic wasting disease map, you'll see where it is all across the country. It's in wild populations. It pops up an awful lot in these, what we just generally refer to as a deer farm, people who are farming deer species. Again, because a lot of times you have a lot of confined animals there. They're moving animals all across the country, selling them to each other. So those are places where it pops up an awful lot. All of that information is on that map to show you where it is. And then if you want real detail, most state wildlife agencies your Department of Natural Resources will have their own maps that can show you more specifically where the disease is spreading. So some states, Kentucky was the most recent state to announce they have it. It's in sort of a small corner, western corner of the state, but it may be other places too. They just haven't found it yet. So it might be really prevalent across the state, like Wisconsin, even Pennsylvania. A lot of areas have it, but it also could be just a tiny spot in a state too. So it just varies depending.
So let's use Kentucky as an example. Given the limited knowledge and research that we have, what's the plan there? Like because obviously you want to isolate that as much as you can. What's the course of action to try to do so?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So yeah, what do we try to do about it? So first thing is education of hunters. They've been hearing about chronic wasting disease, but unless they happen to live or hunt in an area where it is, most hunters aren't paying a whole lot of attention to it. Well, this is an attention getter. So it's an opportunity to tell them about the best management practices that we currently have to try to slow the spread. So things like if you shoot an animal in those areas, number one, get it tested. Number two, you can't just throw it in the back of the truck now and drive it, all over the state and show it off to everybody, because you're moving a potentially infected animal that could spread that disease further. How you dispose of the carcass, your waste parts, is important. So there are some stipulations on that. Other things as far as hunting tactics, we don't want you feeding deer in those situations because that confines them. It brings them together. They're all sticking their face potentially into a food source that we're giving them. Imagine Christmas dinner and someone has COVID and you're all eating from the same plate. Not a good idea. So it's teaching hunters about the best management practices to help slow the spread of the disease. Don't move the animal, proper disposal, get your deer tested. Those are things that hunters can do that are practical. Some states will offer dumpsters for the disposal of parts, leftover parts that go to a landfill. That can be very helpful. So that's what would be happening right now, whether Florida's a recent announcement of CWD, Kentucky, that's where the education is focused right now.
Yeah, it's something interesting I just thought of. So back to kind of the how does hunting help a species out? You think about chronic waste disease. Everybody can acknowledge that that's a what's the word? It's 100% a negative to the deer population. And resources like the dumpster that you can go dump your waste parts, that helps confine that, helps reduce the spread of that, which ultimately helps the deer population. Well, how do you get resources like the dumpster? People hunting, paying for tags, Pittman Robertson Act, things like that. So it's all full cycle using that example, because those resources don't just come out of thin air, right? Like you need money, you need funding for those things to happen.
Well, and to even further that point, imagine if we're trying to control chronic wasting disease by herd control, thinning the herd, and we don't have hunters to do it. So who's going to do it? We could contract and pay people to come in and do what's called targeted removal. Essentially, what happens there is a bait pile is put out, and you have sharpshooters, and they execute deer. And sometimes those deer aren't able to be put to a good use, depending on the situation. There are extreme examples where that might even be necessary, but we don't want to go that route. So hunters, by going out and filling tags, getting deer tested, are really a big part of the solution to that disease. In a number of ways. The dumpsters, you said, as an example, those don't just put themselves out there. We even have people that are hunters that voluntarily put dumpsters out in their areas. They pay for it. So hunters also pay for a lot of conservation that doesn't necessarily go to the state wildlife agency, but in the form of putting conservation on the ground, managing their own land. And really, it's just the contribution by hunting to conservation is nothing else comes close.
Does CWD, you mentioned species barrier between humans potentially, but you mentioned caribou, elk, moose. I'm assuming that it can affect mule deer as well?
Yes, I should have said mule deer, yes.
Is there any evidence of like a dog being able to get it, or like somebody's pet? Has
No,
there been
just
any cases of that?
cervid species. So, hooved animals, hooved wildlife. So not deer, or excuse me, not your pets, not bears, not bobcats, that type of thing. It's literally just essentially a deer disease.
That's so strange. It's strange how that happens. How it can affect those species and then like so detrimentally, like in a really disastrous way. But then other species, not so much. I guess that's a good thing in the long run. I mean, I don't know if
Yeah,
I
I
want my
mean,
dog getting CWD.
diseases are really strange, right? Even like we'll use COVID again. Man, I hate to keep talking about COVID, but it provides such a good example that people can relate to because they've lived it, right? We don't know why some people get it and have one reaction and other people get it and have another. We don't know the answers to those necessarily, okay? Even with the prion disease like CWD, uh, why is it that whitetails seem to get it more so than mule deer get it or elk get it? Even though they can still get it, why do those species get it more? Um, the other thing that'll blow your mind about CWD is it's not even a living thing. When I say a prion is not a living thing. So people will say, well, why can't you just kill the prions? Well, you can't kill something that's already dead. And so when you try to, that's not living. So when you try to wrap your head around CWD, even just looking at the look on your face as I'm explaining this, right? You're like, what? You got to be kidding me. What's this guy talking about? It's very complex. And so that's why I say it's important that we get the research, that the science starts to catch up so that we can learn ways of dealing with this thing.
That is wild to hear. That
Yeah.
it's not a. I mean, that doesn't even make sense to me. How it can see that? Yeah, but that's the example. Is just like there's so much research to be done, and I keep harking on this, but the only way that research will ever get done is the funding that hunting provides. What one thing that you've talked about, I've listened to a couple of your your podcasts to sort of research for this. You've mentioned old versus young deer and in the how important it is to manage age of deer herds in terms of management. And one thing you said, I'm not going to quote specifically, but you said something along the lines of like you can tell when a deer is an older deer. To an uninformed, to the uninitiated, how could somebody be like, oh, that's an older deer?
Yeah. So it's interesting. We are a information education organization, and so we're constantly educating people about the science of deer, and even hunters. The majority of hunters are still pretty casual. They're going out and putting a few days in out there, maybe with a firearm, and they're happy. They're hunters. They enjoy going out a few days, but they don't think about it a whole lot. And so a lot of times we're educating hunters too on these things. And so one of the things that we do, and it's a lot of fun, even non-hunters enjoy doing it, is looking at a deer and try to get an idea of what its age is. And we even have resources. We just reproduced this year one of our more popular video series. It's aging deer on the hoof, and we have one for bucks that takes you through a test at the end that shows you what to look for, and you can get an idea of the age, and also how to identify does as well, and get an idea of what the age is. And so, and it's entirely body characteristics. And so that's not to say that sometimes a deer might be older and it's a runt, and some deer might be younger and it's just a beast. Like in human beings, we have that, right? We all had someone on our little league team that was 12, but was like had hair on their chest and all that going on, right? And so that happens out there. But for the most part, it gives you a pretty good idea of the age of the deer. And so some people, I still get a kick out of it. They'll look at a deer and they'll say, "That deer's really gray in the face. I'll bet he's old." And so the color of a deer has absolutely zero to do with the age of the deer. I even had a neighbor this hunting season sent me a picture of a deer that his niece shot, and was asking about the age. And I looked at it and I said, "Well, that looks like an 18-month-old deer to me." And he was like shocked. It seemed like I was going to say that was a 7 or 8-year-old deer. And so, yeah, if that's something that if you're listening to this and you just want to have a little fun, just Google aging bucks on the hoof, National Deer Association. We have a very well put together program where you can learn about that and you can age the deer. And it's hosted by our Chief Conservation Officer, Kip Adams. It's good stuff. It's fun to do.
What's the what's like the average lifespan of a deer? I guess there's probably two answers. Like that doesn't get hunted, and then also just in general, overall, what would be the average lifespan of a white-tailed deer?
It varies a lot. So we also teach something called aging a deer by looking at the wear on their teeth. And so it's a job, you extract the jawbone and you look at the wear on the teeth, and we have resources to show you how to age a deer based on that. So a lot of people are kind of doing this thing now, right? And so we get some data back. On occasion, on the extreme end of things, you could have someone's, or you can also, let me take a step back. In addition to that, once a deer gets to like 5 years old and older, it's really hard to tell anymore by tooth wear. You can actually send a tooth off, and they cross section it, look at it under a microscope, and much like you look at tree rings, it'll tell you the age of the deer. And so sometimes if people get one that looks really old, they'll do that. And we have had instances of deer come back that were 20 years old.
Wow.
Now that would be the
Oh,
that would be
wow.
the incredibly rare end of things.
Yeah, I've never even heard of anything close to that before.
Yeah, and it's pretty cool. I mean, it just some of the stuff you learn is pretty incredible. I know of people that have gotten deer back that they shot that were 11, 12 years old, which would also be very old in a wild and hunting population. Realistically, we put out something every year called the Deer Report. We're kind of the authority on this. It's all of the harvest information from across the country, and it provides data. Some in some cases, we're able to get data on the ages of deer, approximate ages of deer, and so the average now, I couldn't give you what an average is, but realistically, if you get a buck to be 3 to 4 years old, that's probably pretty good. Some get older than that, a lot die younger than that, and does in some cases can go a little bit older. They're not for many reasons. There's more of them. They're not targeted quite as much sometimes as bucks are, and so but realistically, anything 5 and older is a fully mature animal. And those are rare in the herd. So most of the time we're looking at something younger than that.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is for there to be a herd of deer that are 4, 5, 6 years old, that's going to be a pretty specifically managed area. Like very rarely would you, especially in a hunted area, you're very rarely going to see a herd of deer that are getting to that age consistently. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct for the most part. I know some cases. I mean, I even know myself from hunting. I run a lot of wildlife cameras, and so you can literally, especially bucks, you can get to know a buck over a number of years because they maintain certain antler configurations and so on. And I know of deer that I know of one in particular that was at least 8 years old, and I don't know whatever happened to him. He may have lived longer than that. But that's pretty awesome. I recognize how rare of a thing that was. I know that buck is at least 8 years old based on the years of photos I have of him and encounters. And he may have lived to be 10. I know of other deer that I know that got older that died. I found them dead. And what did they die of? It's hard to say. I mean, deer die of a lot of things. So again, anything 5 and older would be considered a pretty old deer in the population.
Yeah. What would you say is well, actually, before I say that, one thing I've heard you talk about, which I really appreciated, is the idea of trophy deer, like, and how a 5-year-old deer that doesn't have a massive rack is still that's considered a trophy. Like, I like that gauge of quote trophy animals, because when you get down to another word that you've used, which is competitive, like a competition, like outwitting, and the tug and the push and pull of hunting. If you can best a 5, 6-year-old deer, that's a smart deer that's lived that long. So it's almost like a different type of trophy.
Yeah, they are incredibly smart. I mean, the term trophy is one it's kind of plagued hunting because it gets thrown around. You hear of somebody, well, Bob is a trophy hunter. Well, that could mean a million things to different people, right? So I'll use my example. I love archery hunting. And you're not going to find anyone on the planet that loves deer more than I do. There are people that love deer the same as I do. And so I appreciate every single one of them. But from a hunting perspective, I absolutely enjoy trying to match wits with the ones that are older, because they just behave differently. They've reached full maturity. They know how to evade predators. They do things that younger, less experienced deer don't do. And I love that challenge. So that's the competitiveness for me. But that's does and bucks. I have a doe on my land that she has some kind of unique markings on her, so I'm able to tell who she is every single year. And this deer is just, I'm fascinated by her. I mean, this deer is brilliant. She has outwitted me numerous times. I get lots of pictures of her. I've only ever seen her in person, I think a couple of times. And so I have just such a deep respect, and I enjoy that aspect of it. So to me, that's the trophy. It's not necessarily, when you look at bucks, deer are different all across the country. So if you're in Kansas, and in most places in Kansas anyway, and you shoot a buck in Kansas that's even 3 years old, it's likely that his rack or his antlers will be superior to even a 5-year-old deer where I live here in Pennsylvania. So there are different sort of genetic strains. There are different food resources that deer has had from the time it was born till it reached maturity. And so really the age of the deer in a lot of ways is what defines the trophy or the challenge, more so even than what the rack scores. We've just scored racks over the years because that is a physical, tangible thing that you can just score. If we were scoring intelligence and that's what determined trophy, if there was a way to do that, the areas that we look at in the country is sort of the areas with the biggest bucks, the Midwest in particular, may not be the areas with the smartest deer. So it's just sort of an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, there's that quote or saying rather, and it's in the hunting community. I've heard it my whole life, probably relevant outside of hunting as well, but they don't get old by being stupid.
No, I mean, not at all. That part of reaching maturity, there's a little bit of luck sometimes, but there's also just the savviness, knowing how to use their habitat, knowing how to avoid predators that they just figure out, and that's awesome.
How much so we mentioned CWD. Obviously, wolves are prey to many different predator species. The different nuances and all the politics that go into predatory, bringing wolves back into an area or taking them out or not doing this and that. Is that something that's affecting deer populations greatly in certain areas? Obviously not in Georgia. There's not going to be like a wolf issue, but up north, is that something that you're seeing cause some havoc?
It certainly can in areas where the habitat's bad. Okay, if you have suitable habitat, it's pretty amazing how predators and prey can all sort of persist and be happy together. There are definitely extreme examples. Okay, there are extreme examples where there are a lot of wolves, not many deer. It takes a while for deer in those areas to adapt to evading wolves, especially new wolf populations. And so there can be issues. Same thing in certain unique areas, even with things like coyotes, it can be a problem, but it really comes back to habitat. I can tell you that on my little property in Pennsylvania, I get lots of pictures I got lots of deer. That's not a problem. But I have black bears, I have coyotes, I have bobcats, I have fishers, I have all of these other predators. And you know what? I still have rabbits and I still have ruffed grouse. And it's because I put so much effort into the habitat. Animals are good at finding prey. And prey species are good at hiding from predators, and it's all about that balance, right? So if you have good habitat, you can have both. I don't hate wolves. Some people just hate wolves. I'm fascinated by wolves. But do I also recognize that they can be a problem? Absolutely. They can be a problem on livestock. They can be a problem on pets. They can certainly be a problem on deer. But the animal itself, I don't want to villainize the animal. It's a predator out there trying to survive, just like a bear is. I love bears, and I love seeing them. But bears are big deer predators. That's the reality. It's a circle of life out there, and so it's really about good habitat. If you have good habitat, you can support predators and prey pretty equally.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that. I do have a funny story. So right now I'm in 15 minutes from downtown Atlanta, a city of 7 million people. I mean, it's a sprawling metropolitan area. And I'm looking out this window. 2 mornings ago, I wake up and I go for a walk and I see a coyote. And then a couple years ago. I mean, I'm sure they're here, but I was in college, so I didn't see them. But I've seen deer and coyote in my neighborhood, and I live in a pretty my address is the city of Atlanta. So like I live in one of the biggest metro areas in the U.S. and there's deer and coyote that roam around here, which I think speaks to the resilience of both of those species. And it's also just cool. Like I love. Obviously, I'm not going to go shoot a coyote in the middle of a neighborhood, but like it's just cool to watch. You know, it's just cool to know that they're around here hanging out. But you mentioned the habitat. What would be a component or a couple components of that healthy habitat as opposed to a habitat that maybe is not as healthy?
Yeah. So food and cover, those are the two basics, right? So there has to be stuff for animals to eat throughout the year, but cover is a big component of that. And so I'd use the example of the property in my neighborhood that so many people love, and they think it's this big healthy forest, when in fact it's a pretty even age stand mature forest with no understory. So there's no food or cover because of that. No sunlight's hitting the ground. And so therefore, and anything that does try to grow, if you, let's say you have a new oak seedling that starts to pop up, it's going to be eaten in minutes by the first deer that walks by. That's not healthy. What we try to go for often, we talk about what's called early successional habitat, or these variations in habitat. So a chainsaw, for example, can be a wonderful thing. You know, someone might be listening to this and they're freaking out, oh my goodness, you're going to cut a tree down. Well, yes, trees are renewable resources, and it is okay to cut some down. And believe it or not, I've cut quite a few down that I don't do anything with them. They stay there. They create woody debris. They create cover. But the most important thing is it allows sunlight to get to the forest floor, and it allows for regeneration. And so if you go across a well-managed property that's managed for wildlife, you might walk through some areas where you can see a decent distance through the woods, and you may go through other areas where you can't see 5 feet in front of you in the woods. And you'll go through areas that are somewhere in between that. That is good for production of food, especially in the winter. I got asked this question the other day. We were talking about food sources in the winter, and what you don't want to do, don't feed deer. Feeding deer is never good. Feeding wildlife generally is not a good idea, but feeding deer in the winter because you're afraid that they're starving is a bad idea. Deer don't starve in the winter. Their metabolisms are equipped to adapt to these things. But if you are going to feed a deer, there's a really nice natural way to do that, and it's not by throwing a bucket of corn out there. Take a tree down. If you take a tree down, a deer is going to work on that browse. They're going to love it. They love those types of things. That's what they are genetically engineered to be feeding on this time of year, as opposed to putting out an artificial food source, which is just bad for 100 different reasons. So early successional habitat that provides food, that provides cover throughout the year is going to be the winning ticket. I do it as soon as our hunting seasons wrap up here in Pennsylvania. Middle of January, as soon as that's done, I'll be out there with my chainsaws, and I'll be out there trying to remove unfavorable species. Not every tree is a good, healthy tree. A lot of trees can really influence the growth of the trees that you're favoring. So I'm going to be freeing up some of my oak trees. I'm going to be cutting down some trees that aren't helpful. I'm going to be getting light to that forest floor so that when spring comes, those areas start to regenerate. And so really it's about food, it's about cover, things that all of those species can benefit from. And if you do that, you can have both. You can have predators, you can have prey.
Very cool. I've never really thought about it that way, as the habitat being more than partially responsible for the health of the predatory species population and the prey. One thing I find fascinating, correct me if I'm wrong, this is a statistic I've heard, that like there's either more or the same amount of deer supposedly in North America now as there was when Christopher Columbus arrived. Is that correct?
There are actually more.
Oh, wow.
We probably have more deer now than we've ever had, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is just management, though. More and more people, taking an interest, managing land, thinking about sustainable populations. In the early 1900s, deer were it wasn't all that far from being wiped off the face of North America because of deforestation. We talk about habitat, and we just shot a lot of them unregulated. And so there was a period there where If you look at some of the old pictures in the early 1900s, particularly the Appalachian Mountain region, you see these bare hillsides where every tree was cut down. And not only deer, but it's hard for anything to live in that environment. And then there was a time shortly after that during recovery where people would see a deer track or someone would say they saw a deer, and it would be the talk of the town that someone saw a deer. And these are some of the same areas now where they're the best deer hunting in the Midwest. The best deer hunting in the country is in some of these areas where they just didn't have hardly any deer. And then in some areas, and actually in your neck of the woods, deer had to be restocked and brought in from other areas. So if you could imagine, if you could imagine that. So we're at a different time now. People, thanks to people like Theodore Roosevelt, Aldo Leopold, and other great conservationists, started to figure out what was important to keep healthy populations. And we started doing those things, and state wildlife management agencies started doing really good things, and hunters started to care. And so lo and behold, now we have, and we enjoy a more robust deer population probably than ever in North America.
That's pretty wild to think about. Another a parallel that I draw to that is the bison, the story of the American bison, which I'm absolutely fascinated by. I've done a decent amount of research just on the fact that the number that I've seen is anywhere from like 30 to 50 million total bison in like the early 1800s. It got down to like a few hundred is the lowest number I've seen. And the reason I think that's powerful is because, number one, overhunting market hunting without a doubt played a massive role in the downfall of that species. But you flip that coin, and hunting is also the primary reason that species is on the uptick, is on the way up. And it sounds like deer is the exact same way, because it takes the concerned hunter, the person that loves hunting deer, that realizes, oh wow, I can't hunt deer because there's no more deer, so I need to maybe take a step back, change my habits, change what I'm doing, and then also impact other people or influence other people to do the same. And then here we are, hundreds of years after Christopher Columbus arrived with a robust deer population. And that kind of leads into my next question is, if you had to like grade like A, B, C, or D, or F, or whatever, how would you grade the North American deer population now? Like, is it in good standing? Is it would you say it's in harm's way with CWD, or is it relatively stable and healthy?
Yeah, it's definitely in harm's way. There's no question about that, just generally speaking in terms of chronic wasting disease. But let's set CWD aside for now, because even with CWD, deer populations across the country are pretty robust right now. There are always there's always a caveat when I say that, because someone may be listening that's a big hunter and they haven't seen a deer all season, right? And so they're not going to say, this guy's crazy, I don't have a deer where I live. Regionally, locally, your situation may be unique to what's going on. But when you look across the landscape, and I referenced our deer report earlier, deer are doing pretty well across North America, chronic wasting disease aside. And I think there are many reasons for that, but one of the biggest reasons is we give back as a hunting and conservation community more than we take. And that's not what was happening back whenever we got into trouble with these species. When it was market hunting, when it was deforestation, it was about take. Now, and our organization is 100% about this. It's about what can you give to conservation. I may shoot, I'll use my specific land as an example. I may shoot 3 deer. Okay, I've shot 2. I can hunt this winter. I may get 1 more. But I can tell you the effort that I've put into that land has benefited 10 times that amount of animals and deer because I've put the time and I've put the money in. And so I am about giving more than I am taking. And I think as a hunting public, even if you're somebody that's that casual hunter that just goes out for 2 or 3 days, at some point during the year, you're probably going to participate in a raffle or a fundraiser that supports a conservation effort. You're maybe going to go to a banquet or whatever that puts money into the conservation effort. So you're supporting it. You're going to buy a firearm. 11% of that purchase is going to go toward the situation. So I think we've learned that it's about giving more than it is taking, and it's about living more than it is about killing. And I think that's what's led to this situation.
Yeah, and that's obviously conservation over the long haul, the last couple hundred years. Have you seen conservation specifically for deer in North America change in your career in the last 30 years or so? And if so, how have you seen it change?
Yeah, there's no question. I'm so excited to tell you about it. I interrupted you. This organization that I work for is a big part of it. We used to be known as the Quality Deer Management Association back when we started. It's only been through a recent merger that we've changed our name to the National Deer Association. But back in the mid 80s, when this organization was getting started, there certainly was deer research going on and there was information about deer, but it's not nearly what it is now. And so most of the deer at that time that were being shot were yearling deer. And so I can tell you in Pennsylvania, and even when I grew up as a young hunter, it was if it had an antler and it was buck season, you were shooting at that thing. There was no sense about, even age classes or anything like this. And so people think about those things now. Nobody was doing conservation work on their own. Nobody was managing their own land. People do those things now way more than they ever used to. And so I have a 7-year-old, and as he's growing up and being educated about hunting, his education is far different than what mine was, because we didn't talk about conservation. We didn't talk about all of this great habitat work. And the organization that I work for is a big part of the reason that has happened. We changed the landscape of the way people think about hunting and about deer and about the science of deer. And so that's exciting. And so it's definitely changed, and I think it's going to continue to change no matter how much science and research we've done, how much we've learned. We're still always learning more, and that is really cool, and it's just fun to be part of that whole process.
Yeah, and you're right there at the forefront of that with your organization and your line of work and the what you've decided to devote your professional career to, which I think is very, very cool. There's a couple more questions I have, but one in particular is, what is the mission of the NDA, like the National Deer Association? What's y'all's mission?
Yep. And so we've talked about it a lot here, but to boil it down, is to ensure the future of wild deer, habitat, and hunting. It's all the things that we've talked about. It's a very basic mission. We certainly have a national staff that does that, spread out across the country, but we also have a very dedicated membership of over 100,000 people that are out there doing that are maybe even participating. We have branches, which some groups refer to as chapters. So locally, where they're locally led, and they're doing things like raising money and putting habitat on the ground, introducing new people to hunting. And so we've been going through a bit of a growth spurt as well, and an awareness spurt. And so that's our mission, and that's how we get it on the ground, through the love of wildlife and conservation of a lot of people.
That's awesome. And this is more of a personal question, but obviously you've been hunting for a long time. You've probably been on more hunts than you can even count or remember. Is there one particular deer that you've harvested, or one particular hunt that you've been on that kind of stands out as one of your favorites?
Yeah, that's, I don't know if I've ever been asked that question exactly that way. You certainly remember vividly the first deer you ever take. And so those stand out as being just a young kid and being able to tag along with the adults and going hunting for the first time. Those definitely stand out. And then I think later on, as I matured as a hunter, the first mature, when I learned about mature deer and hunting mature deer, the first mature buck that I ever shot is one that stands out. And then, I think my wife and her first deer, taking her out, she had never even fired a gun before she met me. That was
wow.
That left an impression. I'll never forget that. But I would say when I became someone that owned land and managed land and saw what the fruits of my labor were, the first deer that I shot on property that I owned and managed was a proud moment. It's still a proud moment for me. I will sit there, and I've done this many a time. I'll have a deer come right into range, but I'm just observing that night. I'm enjoying watching it use the habitat that I helped create. And so that's just sort of part of the evolution of someone that's been hunting as long as I have. That's winning. That's a successful hunt right there, just enjoying watching that take place.
Yeah, I think that's so cool to hear, because obviously I'm a young buck. I'm 24, so I don't know if I've reached that point in my life yet. My dad will do the same thing, where it's kind of, he's a lot more, I don't want to say passive, but a lot more selective. He's totally cool just being out there watching deer. And I love that. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely love just observing. I mean, even one example, I remember I got down from my stand in Richmond when I was in grad school, and I just literally stared at this doe for like, I don't even know, it felt like 20 minutes, but nobody, I was trying to be as still as I could. And obviously she was like, what the heck's this dude doing? And even that experience, just interacting like in a real life situation, interacting with that species, I'll never forget that moment. We literally just stared at each other. I didn't kill the doe, but it was just one of those things that I'll never forget. So it's cool to hear you talk about the evolution of your hunting to the point where you're totally cool just observing and watching, as you said, the fruits of your labor in that management of that land. It's very, very cool to hear.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you learn so much more by the deer you let pass by and you just observe than the ones, if they walk in and you shoot it right away and it's over, you didn't learn a whole lot from that deer. So as someone that passes, I pass way more deer than I shoot at. I've learned a lot that way.
That's very cool. I two more questions really. Number one, this is kind of the two-part question, but what can I would consider myself a casual hunter. I want it to be a part of my life more than it is. Right now, though, pretty much the only time I hunt is when I come back for holidays. Me and my dad will go to his lease and we'll go hunt and be in the woods. What can I, as a quote casual hunter, do? Like, what's the one actionable step that I can do to help the national, like the North American deer population?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think this show is one example of what you can do, right? You see, you're raising awareness of the situation. You've brought on, you brought me on to talk about this subject, so I think that's one thing you can do. I think continuing to do what you do, continuing to, even though it's challenging for you to get out, to not give up on going out, always make sure that you take time to go. And also, I would challenge you, I'm sure you probably know plenty of people that don't hunt or have never hunted before, challenge you to introduce them to it and maybe take them along or share some venison with them. And those are some ways I think that you can help pass it on, even when you're at a time right now for yourself, you're not getting out as much as you might like.
Yeah, the comment about giving venison, that's another conversation in and of itself. I've had the opportunity to give venison and things to people before, and that is one of the most gratifying things I think a hunter can experience. Other than, like you said with your wife, watching somebody harvest their own animal, but being able to actually give sustenance to another human being that you worked for and were able to harvest and hopefully butcher and process yourself, that's one of the most gratifying things I've ever done. So that's really good advice. I'll definitely take that to heart. And
yep.
My
wife's a vegetarian. Doesn't interrupt you, but my wife's actually a vegetarian, and she shot deer, and she has nothing against eating meat. She just doesn't eat it. And so
Oh, wow.
I keep a couple deer myself, but I give any other deer I shoot, I give away to people that can use them. So yeah, I love sharing venison.
Yeah, it's especially when you can get creative with the ways that you share it, with whether it be jerky or just the good cuts. I'll never forget this either. Last year, my uncle went on an elk hunt and sent my brother home with some backstrap, and we shared some backstrap and then fresh venison heart for a meal, and it was like one of the best meals I've had in a long time. And you can't get that in a restaurant.
No.
The second part to that question is, what can a non-hunter do? Somebody that's listening to this that sort of, like we've talked about, cares about wildlife. They definitely want to see wildlife thrive, specifically in this context, the deer population thrive, which is pretty much a proxy for all of wildlife in many ways. What can a non-hunter do to help ensure the wild deer population?
I think education and being appreciative of what hunting is, what it stands for, having an open mind. If you're listening to this and you came into this conversation with the idea that all hunting is bad and you feel bad for the animals, and we often will put sort of human thoughts and feelings into the minds of animals, and they don't think the way that we do. And I know it's hard to separate from those things. So I think just educate yourself. Go to our website, learn about deer and deer hunting and why people love it so much and what's happening for conservation. There are other great organizations out there as well that you can learn from. It doesn't certainly have to be ours. Organizations that exist just for wildlife conservation. You've got groups like Ducks Unlimited. You've got the National Wild Turkey Federation, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. On the fish side, you got Trout Unlimited. I mean, I don't mean to leave anybody out, but there are a lot of great organizations. Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Go learn about what those organizations are about and what this community is. And hey, if you think you want to try deer hunting and you're listening to this, look us up and we'll see if we can get you into one of our Field to Fork programs and take you out and show you what that experience is all about.
Right on. I think that's great advice. And well, firstly, I want to say we're pushing the hour and 15 mark. I really appreciate your time and your insight. I think what you're doing with the NDA is incredible. And I appreciate you coming on a quote non-hunting podcast and sharing some insight. So thank you for that.
Yep. Thank you for the invite. Happy to be here.
Before we go though, so what are those resources? The website? How can people learn more about the NDA and all that?
Yeah, so we're on every social media platform just about. So if you just look up Deer Association, you'll see our content. We're even on TikTok. We do a really good job on social media. Yeah. So we just actually, there was a scientific paper done that showed that our organization is one of the top 12 in the country in terms of what we accomplish through social media based on our size. So we're very proud of that. And then just deerassociation.com or just Google Deer Association, and you can spend probably most of the rest of your life going through our content and reading it because there's so much out there. So I would encourage people to do that.
Right on. Nick, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. I think this is a necessary conversation, and I'm glad to be a part of it. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.